My son beat me up just because the soup wasn't salted. The next morning he said, "My wife is coming for lunch, cover everything up and smile." Then he went to the office, and when he entered his boss's room, he turned as pale as chalk. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic, a comforting aroma that usually brought warmth to the small suburban house where Helen lived with her son, Eric. It was just past 6 o'clock in the evening, and the light from the setting sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor. Helen, now 68 years old, moved carefully between the stove and the counter, stirring a pot of vegetable stew that simmered gently. She tasted a spoonful, paused, then added a pinch of dried herbs, confident that dinner was just about right. Eric's footsteps echoed in the hallway before he entered the kitchen. Dressed in a dark suit with his tie loosened and shoulders stiff from the day's work, he dropped his briefcase by the table without a word. Helen greeted him with a soft smile. "Dinner's ready," she said, motioning to the table already set for two. Linen napkins, plain white plates, and 2 glasses of water stood neatly in their places. She had made his favorite, beef stew with carrots and potatoes, and even baked a small loaf of bread earlier that afternoon. Eric sat down with a sigh, picked up his fork, and began to eat without much ceremony. For a few moments, the room was filled only with the sounds of cutlery and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawn mower. Then he paused, setting down his fork with a quiet clink. "It's missing salt," he said, not looking up. Helen blinked. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I must have forgotten. Let me—" "It's fine," he cut in, still avoiding her gaze. His tone wasn't sharp, but it wasn't gentle either. "Just pay more attention next time." She gave a small nod and reached for the salt shaker, placing it silently beside his plate. Eric resumed eating, adding a few generous shakes without comment. The meal continued in an uncomfortable quiet. Helen's appetite faded quickly. She stirred her food more than she ate it, stealing glances at her son's expression. His jaw was tight, and his brow remained furrowed. She knew that look too well. It meant the day had not been kind to him. Maybe traffic had been bad. Maybe work was piling up. Maybe someone had said the wrong thing at the wrong moment. Still, it stung. A simple oversight, nothing more, had shifted the evening from quiet comfort to quiet tension. After dinner, Eric excused himself with a mumbled, "I'll be in the office," and disappeared into the back room that had once been his childhood bedroom. The door clicked shut behind him. Helen remained at the table, her fingers loosely wrapped around a half-full glass of water. She sat there for a while, alone in the kitchen, listening to the faint tapping of Eric's computer keys behind the closed door. The stew on her plate grew cold. Later that evening, as she rinsed the dishes in warm, soapy water, she caught her reflection in the small kitchen window. Her gray hair, neatly pulled back, framed a face lined with age and something harder to define, fatigue, maybe. Or the quiet erosion of 1,000 moments just like this one. She reminded herself that Eric worked hard, that the world outside their home was demanding and cold. He didn't mean to be short with her. He was tired, not unkind. He just wanted things to be right. Still, the feeling lingered, that small, sinking weight in her chest. In the corner of the room sat an empty salt jar, just refilled earlier that morning. It struck her then, oddly, how something so small, so easy to fix, could still change the whole atmosphere of a room. That night, when she climbed into bed, the house silent around her, Helen stared at the ceiling longer than usual. The walls were familiar. The routines were well rehearsed. And yet, something unspoken had settled into the spaces between them, between mother and son. It wasn't anger, not exactly. Nor resentment. It was more like carefulness. A tiptoeing. An effort not to disturb. As she closed her eyes, Helen promised herself she would pay more attention next time. To the seasoning. To the silence. To everything that was said, and unsaid. She didn't know yet that a single pinch of salt could mark the beginning of a deeper reckoning. For now, it was just another evening. But something had shifted, ever so slightly. And it would not go unnoticed for long. The next morning began with the soft rattle of dishes and the gurgle of the old coffee maker in the corner of the kitchen. Helen moved through her usual motions, her hands familiar with every step. 2 scoops of ground coffee, fill the kettle, slice 2 pieces of toast. The routine was calming, but her mind wandered. The night before had left a residue, a subtle discomfort that she couldn't quite brush away. She heard Eric's footsteps descending the stairs just as the coffee finished brewing. He entered the kitchen dressed in his usual work attire, pressed slacks, a light blue shirt, and a tie that looked freshly ironed. He didn't greet her right away. Instead, he reached for the cabinet, grabbed a mug, and poured himself a cup. Helen offered a tentative smile. "Would you like toast this morning?" He nodded without looking up. "Sure. Thanks." She slid the slices onto a plate and added a small pat of butter beside them. He sat at the table, checked something on his phone, then finally glanced up at her. "Julia's coming for lunch today," he said casually, but the tone lacked softness. "So please make sure everything looks nice. And, if you can, smile, okay?" Helen paused, her hand still on the counter. The request itself wasn't shocking. Julia had visited before, and Helen always tried to make her feel welcome. But the way he said it, quick, clipped, and oddly performative, made something tighten in her chest. "Of course," she replied gently. "It'll be lovely to have her." Eric took a sip of his coffee, eyes back on his phone. "Just don't overdo it, all right? Keep it simple. No need for a full feast or anything. I just want things pleasant." "All right," she said again, still calm. "I'll make something light." He nodded, already halfway through a text message. The toast went mostly untouched. After he left for work, Helen stood at the window, her tea cooling in her hands. She wasn't angry, exactly. But that phrase, "just smile," echoed strangely in her mind. She understood the sentiment behind it, or thought she did. He wanted her to make a good impression, to help everything feel easy. Still, it wasn't the words themselves that unsettled her. It was the implication that she had somehow become not enough. Too quiet, too neutral, too distant. That she now needed to be reminded to smile. She shook the thought away and turned her focus to lunch preparations. Julia was kind. Thoughtful. Their conversations were always gentle, and Helen had never felt judged by her. Still, she found herself moving with extra care, polishing the silverware, fluffing the cushions in the living room, even changing her blouse for something with a little color. By 11:30, the table was set. A fresh salad, warm bread, and lemon-herb chicken filled the kitchen with a welcoming aroma. Helen had even placed a small vase of garden flowers on the table. Not overdone, just nice, just warm. The doorbell rang at noon. Helen opened it to see Julia standing on the porch with a soft smile, her shoulder-length hair pinned back neatly and a tote bag over one arm. "Hi, Helen," she said warmly, leaning in for a quick hug. "Something smells amazing." "Come in, dear," Helen said, stepping aside. "I hope you're hungry." Julia laughed lightly. "Always." They chatted as Julia slipped off her shoes and made her way to the table. Eric arrived moments later, just in time to pour drinks and slide into his seat. He kissed Julia on the cheek, then glanced at Helen with a quick nod. Lunch started smoothly. The conversation stayed light, work updates, mild jokes about traffic, and a brief mention of a documentary Julia had recently watched. But Helen noticed that her voice felt thinner than usual, her smiles a touch too deliberate. She tried to stay present, to truly engage, but there was a dissonance inside her she couldn't quite quiet. Midway through the meal, Julia looked at her more directly. "I've missed our talks, Helen," she said gently. "You've been so quiet lately. Everything all right?" Helen blinked, caught slightly off guard. She gave a small, practiced smile. "Oh, everything's fine. I've just been a bit tired lately. Age catching up with me, I suppose." Julia tilted her head. "You always brought such great energy to the room. I miss hearing your stories. Eric shifted slightly in his chair, his fork pausing over his plate. Helen offered a softer smile, this one more real. Maybe I just need a bit of sunshine and good company to warm me up again. Julia smiled back, but there was something in her expression, a flicker of concern, or maybe curiosity, that lingered. After lunch, Julia offered to help clean, but Helen waved her off. You two go relax, she insisted. Let me handle this. From the kitchen, she could hear their muffled conversation in the living room, low voices, comfortable tones. She moved slowly, rinsing plates, letting her thoughts flow with the water. It wasn't Julia's words that had stirred her, but the fact that someone had noticed. That someone outside of this house had seen the subtle shrinking of her presence. Later, after Julia left and the house settled back into its usual quiet, Eric came into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her dry the last dish. Lunch went well, he said. Yes, Helen replied without turning. Julia's always lovely to talk to. He hesitated. She asked about you. Thought you seemed a little off. Helen folded the dish towel slowly. Did she? Eric looked away briefly. You were smiling, though. That was good. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she set the towel down and finally looked at him. Her voice remained even. Eric, do you think I've changed? He seemed caught off guard. What do you mean? I mean, do you think I've become someone who needs to be reminded to smile? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I just meant. I didn't want anything to feel awkward. Helen gave a small nod. I understand. There was a pause. The air between them was filled with quiet tension, not anger, not hostility, but something more delicate and harder to name. Then Eric shrugged slightly. I should get back to some emails, he muttered, turning away. As he left the room, Helen remained standing by the sink. Her hands were empty, but her mind was full. For years she had moved through this house with quiet precision, maintaining harmony, avoiding disruption. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt a different pull, something stirring beneath the surface. It wasn't rebellion, exactly. It was more like the first breath after holding one's breath too long. A recognition that she was still here, still present, still capable of being more than just a silent caretaker in someone else's story. And it had taken only one sentence to bring it to the surface. Just smile. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the living room curtains, creating a gentle light that made the modest furniture and polished wooden floor appear warmer than usual. Julia sat on the edge of the beige couch, a cup of tea in her hands, while Eric scrolled through his phone across from her. The lunch dishes had been cleared, the house was quiet again, and Helen had retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of organizing leftovers. In truth, she needed a few more moments alone, a space to settle the emotion that still lingered from earlier conversations. From the living room, Julia's voice carried back softly, I think your mom's stew was even better than last time. Did she use lemon this time? Eric looked up briefly. I don't know. Maybe. Julia smiled to herself and glanced toward the kitchen. She didn't talk much today. She was probably just tired, Eric replied. She's been slowing down a bit lately. Julia gave a small nod but said nothing more for the moment. After a pause, she rose and walked into the kitchen without announcing herself. Helen was rinsing out a container at the sink, her hands moving mechanically, her eyes distant. Julia waited a moment before speaking. Hey, she said gently, not wanting to startle her. Helen turned slightly, then gave a welcoming smile, not the strained one from earlier, but still a touch reserved. Oh, hello again, dear. I thought you'd left already. I was just finishing my tea, Julia said, stepping further into the kitchen. Thought I'd help with the rest of the cleanup. Helen waved a damp hand lightly. No need, I've almost finished. But thank you. Julia leaned against the counter, watching her mother-in-law move. There was something deeply graceful about Helen's gestures, precise, practiced, patient, But Julia sensed a kind of stiffness underneath. Not physical, but emotional. As if Helen was carrying something she didn't know how to put down. "I hope I didn't put you on the spot earlier," Julia said, keeping her voice soft. "At lunch, I noticed you seemed a bit quiet. Didn't mean to pry." Helen dried her hands with a towel and finally met Julia's eyes. "You didn't pry," she said gently. "I suppose I've just been more inward lately. Thinking about things." Julia tilted her head. "Anything in particular?" Helen considered her for a moment before replying. "Memories. The past. How life feels different when the house gets quieter." Julia didn't press further. Instead, she offered a sincere, quiet presence, allowing the silence to breathe between them. She was learning, over time, that Helen wasn't a woman who unfolded easily. Her affection came in acts of care, not in declarations. Still, the change was noticeable. Something about her posture, her expression, her hesitations, it all felt new, or at least newly visible. "Sometimes I miss our little chats," Julia said. "The way you used to tell me about your garden, or those funny stories about Eric when he was young. You always had a calm way of making me feel at home." Helen gave a soft chuckle. "Those were good stories. And the garden? I haven't touched it in a while." "You should," Julia said warmly. "It always brought you joy." Helen nodded faintly but didn't respond right away. She dried the last dish and set it carefully in the rack. "It's strange," she said finally. "How you can live in a place so long and still feel like a guest in certain rooms." Julia frowned slightly, unsure how to respond to that. Before she could find the words, Helen turned back to her with a kind smile, as if to brush the moment away. "But it was good to have you here today," she added quickly. "It brought a nice energy to the house." "I'm glad," Julia said. She hesitated again, sensing something unspoken. Then, after a beat, she asked, "Would you want to come out for lunch sometime? Just the two of us?" Helen blinked, surprised. "Oh, well, that's kind of you. I'd like that." Julia smiled. "Maybe next week? I know a place near the museum, has great quiches and even better pastries." "All right," Helen replied, her voice quiet but clear. "Let's do that." When Julia returned to the living room, Eric looked up from his phone. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," she said simply. "Your mom's just thoughtful today." Eric shrugged. "She gets like that sometimes." Julia didn't respond. Instead, her gaze lingered on the hallway that led to Helen's room, and something settled in her chest, not quite worry, but a sense of awareness. The kind that comes when you notice a shift, subtle but unmistakable, in someone you've known for years. Later that evening, after Julia had gone home and the quiet of the house returned, Helen sat in her room with a photo album open on her lap. She flipped through pages slowly, images of her wedding day, Eric's childhood birthdays, picnics in the backyard, winters spent by the fireplace. One picture made her pause. Eric at age 10, grinning with a missing front tooth, standing beside a snowman they had built together. She could still remember how cold his fingers were when he refused to wear gloves, how they had laughed when the snowman's carrot nose kept falling off. She traced a fingertip over the photo's edge and smiled, but her eyes clouded a little. She wasn't sure when the laughter had grown quieter in the house. She only knew it had happened gradually, quietly, like dust settling on a forgotten shelf. That night, she didn't sleep right away. The house was silent, but her thoughts were full. Not just of memories, but of the conversation with Julia. It wasn't the invitation itself that lingered, it was the simple kindness behind it. A recognition. An offer to see her not as a role, or an obligation, but as a person worth knowing. Worth spending time with. And it was in that quiet space, beneath the weight of decades and dishes and daily routines, that Helen began to sense something stirring. Not quite a plan, not even a decision, just a feeling. The faintest sense that she was more than a backdrop in her own life. The next morning, when she woke to the sound of birds outside the window and the first golden stretch of light across her bedspread, she found herself reaching for her slippers with a different sort of intention. Something had been noticed. And that was where things always began. The morning passed slowly, in the way mornings do when there is no urgency to be anywhere, when the house is still and quiet and the hours seem to unfold rather than pass. Helen sat at the small dining table with her usual cup of tea, but she wasn't reading the paper as she normally did. Her eyes were turned toward the bookshelf in the corner of the room, a tall, narrow piece of oak furniture her late husband had built decades ago. It stood against the wall like a silent witness, filled with hardcover novels, travel guides, and a scattering of framed photos that had accumulated over the years. Helen looked at it now not as furniture, but as memory, layered, dense, and long ignored. There was something in her that wanted to reach for it, though she wasn't sure why. She stood slowly, placing her tea on the table. The floor creaked gently beneath her as she crossed the room and touched the edge of the first frame. It was a photo of her wedding day, she in a white lace dress with sleeves that no one would wear now, and Robert, tall and beaming beside her. His eyes had that warmth that made everyone feel at ease. She had forgotten how young they looked. Next to it was a picture of Eric at age 7, missing his front teeth and holding up a papier-mâché project from school. She remembered that day too clearly, how he had come home proud, how he'd wanted it displayed on the mantel. She had kept it for years before it crumbled with time. She picked up another photo, one of the whole family at a local beach, the three of them laughing, faces turned to the sun. Eric had been around 16, his hair a little too long and his smile still innocent. Helen sat down on the couch with the picture in her lap, and the silence of the house pressed in around her, not oppressive, but heavy with meaning. She hadn't allowed herself to really look at these photos in a long while. They had become background objects, part of the house's decor rather than active pieces of memory. But now, as she sat with the images, she realized how much she missed the people they held, not just her husband, but even the version of Eric that used to smile without restraint, that used to ask her questions about the world, that used to sit beside her just to talk. It was not that she disliked the man her son had become. She knew he carried responsibilities. Life was demanding. But the distance that had grown between them, the routine that replaced connection, it was undeniable. She felt it in the way he spoke, in how rarely he listened. The knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She blinked, setting the photo down gently on the couch cushion beside her, and moved toward the door. When she opened it, a delivery man handed her a small box. Delivery for Helen Greaves? She nodded, surprised. Yes, thank you. He offered a polite smile and walked back to his van. Helen turned the box in her hands. No return address she recognized, but the handwriting was familiar. She brought it inside and carefully opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a slim paperback novel, worn around the edges. Tucked into the front cover was a note, folded in half. Dear Helen, I was going through some old books and came across this. You lent it to me 20 years ago and told me it changed how you saw things. I finally read it, twice, and you were right. I'm sorry it took me so long. Let's have that coffee soon. I've missed our talks. Warmly. Marjorie. Helen smiled. The name pulled something bright and unexpected from her memory. Marjorie, her neighbor and friend from years ago, had moved away after her husband's retirement. They'd lost touch after a while, not from any falling out, but simply from time and circumstance. And yet here was this book, this memory, returned to her like a message from the past. She ran her hand over the cover. It was a novel she had read in her 30s, a story about a woman who changed her life late in age, not because she had to, but because she finally wanted to. Helen remembered how much it had resonated with her at the time. She hadn't thought about it in years. Later that day, after finishing her housework and folding the laundry, Helen retrieved a box from the top of her bedroom closet. It was labeled Robert's Things. She had kept it there, untouched, since the year he passed. She placed it gently on the bed, sat down beside it, and opened it slowly. Inside were old birthday cards, a shaving kit, a few of his favorite ties, and a small notebook. She opened the notebook carefully. It was Robert's journal, or perhaps just a place where he scribbled thoughts and quotes. Most pages were short entries, things he'd heard or read that had moved him. But one entry caught her attention. The home we build is not made of wood or bricks. It's made of presence. Of listening. Of remembering who we are to each other. She read the sentence twice, then a third time. It was dated 6 months before his passing. Her eyes welled, but not from sadness alone. It was recognition. He had always understood something that she, perhaps, had forgotten in the years since his death. That living with someone was not the same as being present with them. That houses became quiet not just from silence, but from the absence of being truly seen. That evening, Helen took the photo album and the novel from Marjorie and placed them both on the kitchen table. Then, with intention, she moved to the living room, selected a few books and photos from the shelf, and began rearranging them. Not in any dramatic way, just enough to bring attention back to them. To make them active parts of the space again. She placed the wedding photo closer to the center. Swapped out a dusty travel guide for the returned novel. She even found a small ceramic bird figurine from her garden days and placed it on the shelf's middle tier, next to a framed picture of Eric as a toddler. When Eric returned home that evening, he passed the living room without pause, heading straight for his office. But Helen didn't mind. She wasn't doing it for him, not anymore. Later, before bed, she wrote in a small notebook she hadn't touched in years. Nothing elaborate. Just a sentence. I'm still here. And I remember who I am. Then she closed the notebook, set it on her bedside table, and turned out the light. The house was still quiet, but the silence felt different now, no longer empty, but expectant. She didn't know what would change or how. But something had already begun. Not in the words others spoke to her, but in the way she had started looking at the world around her again. In how memory, instead of holding her back, was beginning to open a path forward. It started with a look toward a forgotten shelf. And it would not stop there. She woke early the next day to a pale shaft of morning light across her bedroom floor. As she sat on the edge of the bed, her mind wasn't on the day's tasks but on the small shifts that had begun turning inside her. The return of Marjorie's book and the momentary awakening those images had brought remained vivid as a quiet echo. She felt a lightness, an unfamiliar lightness, that invited something new into the day. Instead of starting her usual routine, she stood and drew an old leather-bound journal from beneath her pillow. It was one she'd kept in her youth, filled with sketches, quotations, little reflections about what it meant to live deliberately. She flipped through the pages, reading entries she hadn't read in decades. One line stood out: "To be visible in your own life is the greatest courage." She hesitated over the words, then turned to a blank page and wrote slowly. "I want to be visible. I want to be more than the tasks I do." She closed the journal, feeling a small but definite resolve stir in her. That morning, she deliberately dressed in a brighter color, a soft teal blouse that complemented her gray hair. For once, the mirror reflected something unexpected, not just a caretaker or a mother, but a woman with presence. Later, she stepped into the sunlight outside and walked to the garden, where she hadn't spent much time since winter had faded. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, promising new blooms. The air was cool, the earth smelled rich. She knelt and touched a sprig of lavender, inhaling its scent and letting something within her settle. As she stood, she spotted Julia walking up the street. Julia paused and waved, then walked over, her usual warmth bright in the morning light. "Helen," Julia said, smiling, "I thought I'd drop by, since we're meeting for lunch next week, and bring you this." She held out a small pot of fresh basil. "Oh, Julia, this is lovely," Helen said, taken by the unexpectedness of the gesture. "I thought it might brighten your kitchen," Julia said, placing it gently on the small garden table. "And maybe we can plant it together, if you'd like." Helen nodded. "I'd like that very much." They stood by the table for a moment, 2 generations linked by quiet connection, and Helen realized she wasn't shrinking back. She was stepping forward, gently, but undeniably. Inside later, Eric returned home earlier than usual. He found Helen at the doorway of the living room, brushing off her hands, clothes streaked faintly with soil. "You've been in the garden?" he asked, curiosity softening his tone. "Yes," she replied, a slight smile lifting her voice. "I thought it was time to say hello to it again." He paused, expression unreadable for a moment. Then, almost reluctantly, he smiled. "That's good. It's good." Dinner that evening was more relaxed than it had been in days. Helen served a vegetable tart, something she'd brought from a new recipe she'd found in Marjorie's returned book. The crust was slightly thicker than usual, the flavors unfamiliar but comforting. She served the basil on the side, chopping it and scattering it atop the steaming tart as they ate. Eric ate slowly, nodding at the taste. "This is different," he said, thoughtful. "I like it." Helen felt something shift in the room, soft, surprising, like a door cracked open. Julia arrived later, joining them at the table this time. The three of them lingered over dessert, slices of pound cake with a spoonful of lemon curd. Conversation flowed, light anecdotes, quiet laughter. Helen found herself telling a childhood memory, building sandcastles with Eric on that beach depicted in one of the photos. Even Eric laughed softly, and Julia's eyes carried warmth and acknowledgement. Afterward, when Julia left and Eric excused himself to his office, he lingered near the doorway. "Your dinner was wonderful," he said. "Thank you," Helen replied, sensing something beyond gratitude in his tone. "I used that new basil, Marjorie sent it to me." Eric nodded slowly. "That's nice, Mom." "Really?" As the night deepened and the house settled into its usual quiet, Helen returned to the living room. She picked up the basil plant and placed it thoughtfully on the coffee table, near a photo of her and Marjorie from years ago. The leaves brushed lightly against the frame. She exhaled, feeling alive in the silence that had once felt too vast. Memory had invited new growth, not just in the soil but in the rooms and in the relationships. The breadcrumb of change was not a roar but a whisper, just enough to feel seen again. And she was. The following Monday, the air in the office was heavier than usual. Not oppressive, just different. The fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly overhead, and the clatter of keyboards and faint murmur of phone conversations filled the open workspace like background music. But there was a shift in energy, subtle but unmistakable. Eric noticed it the moment he stepped out of the elevator and onto the third floor. Colleagues stood in small clusters near their desks, speaking in low tones. Faces wore expressions of restrained curiosity, like people waiting for news they had only half anticipated. Eric moved toward his desk, catching a glance from Deborah, who had worked 2 cubicles down from him for nearly a decade. "She's already here," Deborah whispered when he passed. "I saw her go into the conference room about 20 minutes ago." Eric raised an eyebrow. "She? You mean Langdon?" Deborah nodded. "Sarah Langdon. She's our new team lead. And she brought her own mug." Her tone was half amused, half cautious. Eric said nothing, but the name turned something uneasy in his chest. He knew of Langdon, everyone in corporate did. She had built a quiet reputation for restructuring underperforming departments, emphasizing direct communication, and making quick, sometimes uncomfortable changes. She was neither feared nor beloved. She was respected. And she was his new boss. He sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and stared at the screen without really seeing it. He had grown comfortable in his role over the years. The patterns, the expectations, the rhythms, they were all predictable. But now that predictability felt like it was being remeasured by someone with new standards. Someone who might not be impressed by long tenure or consistent effort alone. At precisely 9 o'clock, the notification for the team meeting appeared on his screen. Introduction with Sarah Langdon, Conference Room B. Eric took a breath, stood, and made his way there with the others. The room was bright, with wide windows letting in the early sunlight. A dozen chairs were arranged in a loose circle, and standing near the far wall was a tall woman in her late 40s with short, dark hair and sharp but kind eyes. She wore a navy blazer over a simple cream blouse and held a notepad in her hand. She wasn't smiling broadly, but there was an ease about her, something composed and deliberate. "Good morning," she said as everyone settled in. "I'm Sarah Langdon. You've likely heard some version of who I am or what I do. I'll let you know right now, I'm not here to dismantle anything that works. I'm here to learn what you do well, where things get stuck, and how we can function more like a team than a list of names in a workflow." Eric listened, arms crossed. Her voice was firm but not cold. She didn't talk like someone who wanted to impress. She talked like someone who wanted the truth. "I want to hear from all of you over the next 2 weeks," she continued. "Short one-on-ones. No performance reviews, no pressure, just conversations. I'm interested in what you care about, what frustrates you, and what you think this place could be." Deborah raised her hand. "So, like, informal check-ins?" "Exactly," Sarah said. "This place has a lot of talent. I'm here to listen first." Eric said nothing during the meeting, but he watched her closely. She wasn't trying to win them over. She wasn't promising too much. But there was something about her that made him slightly uncomfortable in ways he didn't understand. After the meeting, he returned to his desk and tried to resume work, but his focus drifted. He thought about Helen, about her sudden reawakening in the past few days, the way she had begun to speak more, to move differently, even to joke a little at dinner. He wasn't sure what to make of it. He had grown used to the quiet version of her. The one who didn't push, didn't interrupt, didn't express much that wasn't tied to the running of the household. This new Helen, curious, independent, left him feeling unsteady. He checked his calendar. His one-on-one with Sarah was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Just 15 minutes. Still, he felt as if he needed to prepare for a test he didn't understand. That evening, after returning home, he found Helen in the living room, sitting on the floor with an old box of photos spread out in front of her. She looked up and smiled. "Just organizing some old things," she said. "Thought I might frame a few pictures. The house could use more life on the walls." Eric set down his briefcase and watched her for a moment. "You've been doing a lot around here lately." She shrugged lightly. "It's time." He hesitated before speaking again. "I met my new manager today. Sarah Langdon." Helen's hands paused briefly over the photo in her lap. "I've heard that name before. Isn't she known for shaking things up?" Eric nodded. "Something like that. She's not what I expected." Helen smiled faintly. "Sometimes those are the people we need to meet." Eric frowned. "What do you mean?" Helen didn't answer right away. She picked up a photo, one of Eric at age 12, arms wrapped around a beagle puppy they'd adopted that summer, and handed it to him. "You used to always ask questions. You were so curious. You wanted to understand everything." Eric took the photo and studied it. He didn't remember that version of himself very well. He remembered the years of reports, promotions, daily commutes, and balancing everything without letting anyone down. He remembered control. "Maybe it's time to ask some questions again," Helen added gently. He looked at her, unsure if she was talking about him, or herself, or both. On Wednesday morning, Eric sat outside Sarah's office 5 minutes early. When the door opened and the previous colleague left, Sarah stepped out and greeted him with a simple nod. "Come in, Eric." He followed her inside. The office was minimalist, no awards, no clutter, just a few well-chosen books on the shelf and a framed print of a forest path. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "I'll keep this short," she said. "No need for formality. I'm trying to get a feel for the team, how things work, how people are doing, what gets in their way." Eric cleared his throat. "Everything's fine on my end. I stay on top of my workload." "I believe you," she said easily. "But I'm not asking for your metrics. I'm asking how you feel about your work. About your team. About the way this place operates." He hesitated. "It's predictable." Sarah smiled, not unkindly. Predictability can be a comfort. Or a trap. He looked at her, surprised by the bluntness. I suppose it depends on the person. It does, she agreed. But you strike me as someone who could be doing more than just moving papers. Have you thought about that? Eric leaned back slightly. Are you asking if I'm dissatisfied? No. I'm asking if you're hiding your potential under routine. The words sat between them for a moment, heavier than expected. I'll think about it, Eric said finally. Good, Sarah replied. That's all I ask for now. He left her office with something unexpected stirring in him, not doubt, but the unfamiliar weight of a mirror held up without accusation. He thought of Helen again. Of the garden. Of the photos. Of her new voice emerging after years of quiet. Maybe change wasn't just happening to her. Maybe it was happening to both of them. Thursday morning unfolded in a slow and deliberate rhythm. The autumn light through the kitchen windows was pale and soft, casting elongated shadows across the table where Helen sat alone, a pen in hand, staring at the open pages of her journal. It had been years since she had written anything longer than grocery lists or reminders scribbled on the back of envelopes. But lately, something inside her had shifted. She was beginning to crave her own voice again, not the one used in polite conversation, but the one that lived quietly inside her for decades, unnoticed and unanswered. The entry she wrote that morning was not elaborate. It was honest, tentative. She didn't write to document events. She wrote to understand them. To understand herself. A single sentence stood out on the page. I spent so many years keeping peace that I forgot how to live in the sound of my own thoughts. The word surprised her. She put the pen down and ran her fingers over the sentence, rereading it again and again. And as she sat in the silence of her kitchen, Helen realized that the life she had carefully built, structured, safe, predictable, had also been one of concealment. Her days were filled with movement but not momentum. She had been present in the room, but absent in the mirror. Later that afternoon, she received a phone call that she hadn't expected. Marjorie. Helen, came the familiar voice on the line, hesitant but warm. I hope this isn't a bad time. Not at all, Helen replied, surprised by how quickly she smiled. I've been thinking about you. Well, Marjorie chuckled, then I suppose I picked the right moment. I wanted to ask if you'd like to meet for coffee. Or a walk. Or something. It's been far too long. Helen hesitated only a second. Yes. I'd love to. They arranged to meet at a small cafe near the park the following morning. That night, Helen stood in front of her closet longer than usual. She wasn't dressing for anyone's approval, not anymore. But she was dressing for herself, for the woman who had once loved color and detail, who had once lingered over earrings and scarves and jackets with unique buttons. She chose a soft green cardigan she hadn't worn in years and a pair of leather boots that reminded her of old walks downtown with Robert. The next day dawned crisp and clear. The cafe sat on a quiet street corner, tucked between a bookshop and a florist, its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. When Helen arrived, Marjorie was already there, seated at a corner table by the window, her hair now completely silver and her eyes exactly as Helen remembered them, sharp, curious, kind. They hugged like no time had passed. I still remember your coffee order, Marjorie said, motioning to the cup already waiting. Black, no sugar. You always did pay attention, Helen smiled. They sat, and for a few moments, neither spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the pause of people reacquainting themselves with someone they once knew by heart. Then Marjorie leaned forward. You look well, she said sincerely. Different, but well. Helen nodded. I've been rediscovering things. Myself, mostly. I can tell, Marjorie replied. You feel lighter somehow. Helen looked out the window. A young couple walked by holding hands, laughing softly. A woman entered the florist next door and emerged moments later with a bouquet wrapped in brown paper. I spent so long moving around someone else's center of gravity, Helen said quietly. I forgot I had my own. Marjorie reached across the table, touching Helen's hand lightly. That sounds like something you would have said 20 years ago, only now you believe it. Helen met her gaze. I think I'm starting to. They spoke for over an hour, catching up on small things, old friends, health concerns, the absurdities of growing older, and then slowly, the conversation deepened. Helen talked about Eric, about the weight of their unspoken tensions, about the comfort that had quietly curdled into distance over the years. I don't think he even realizes how much space he takes up, Helen said. Or how much I gave up trying not to take any. Marjorie listened without interruption. Then she said, maybe he's waiting for you to remind him who you are. Helen considered this. I used to think I had to stay silent to keep the peace. But peace without presence isn't real. Marjorie smiled. No. It's just a polite silence. When they finally stood to leave, Helen felt different than she had in a long time, not just understood, but remembered. Like a version of herself she had long ago packed away had been gently retrieved and dusted off. On the walk home, she took a longer route through the park. The leaves were beginning to fall, and children played among the golden piles, their laughter carrying through the breeze. She watched them, her hands in her pockets, and allowed herself the luxury of imagining a different kind of season ahead, not a reinvention, but a return. That evening, after dinner, Helen sat down at the kitchen table with her journal again. Eric had already retreated to his office, as he often did, and the house had slipped into its usual hush. She began to write, her pen moving faster than usual. Today, I remembered what it's like to be more than a role. I spoke without measuring every word. I laughed without worrying about how it might sound. I listened to a friend and heard myself in her voice. I was present. As she closed the journal, Helen heard Eric's office door open. He stepped into the hallway, paused, and looked toward the kitchen. You were out today, he said, a note of curiosity in his voice. Yes, she replied evenly. I had coffee with Marjorie. He nodded slowly, then after a pause added, that's good. There was no further conversation. He disappeared back down the hallway. But Helen felt no frustration, no disappointment. Change was not something she expected from him, it was something she was giving herself permission to embrace. Later, as she climbed into bed, she left the journal on her nightstand, open to that final sentence. And for the first time in years, she fell asleep with the feeling that something real was beginning, not around her, but inside. Friday afternoon unfolded with the deceptive calm of routine. The house was quiet, warm, and sunlit, nothing out of place, no sign that anything unexpected would unfold. Helen had spent her morning in the garden, trimming back the last of the summer herbs and planting a few winter bulbs with her gloves pulled tight against the autumn chill. She moved with ease, her movements grounded in habit, but her mind wandered elsewhere, to the cafe conversation with Marjorie, to the sentence she'd written in her journal the night before, to the awareness that something inside her had crossed a quiet but unmistakable threshold. Inside, the living room clock ticked softly. It was nearly 6 o'clock. Traditionally, she would already have dinner simmering. A roast, perhaps, or soup with crusty bread. But today, there was nothing on the stove, no plate set, no pots clattering in the sink. She hadn't forgotten. She'd made a choice. Earlier that day, Marjorie had invited her for a spontaneous stroll through the neighborhood, followed by tea at her apartment. Helen had gone. The walk turned into hours of shared stories, laughter, and simple companionship. And she'd returned later than planned, unapologetically so. She was just stepping out of the shower when she heard the front door open. Eric's footsteps, heavier than usual, moved briskly through the hallway. There was no greeting, just the rustling of his coat being hung and the thud of his briefcase placed on the hallway bench. Helen, now dressed in a robe, emerged from her bedroom with a towel in hand, drying her hair. Evening, Eric, she said lightly. Eric stood in the kitchen doorway, his brow already furrowed. There's no dinner? Helen continued toweling her hair as she walked past him to the hallway closet. I went out this afternoon. Lost track of time. Didn't get the chance to cook anything. Eric blinked. You went out? Yes, she said, folding the towel and setting it on the bench. Marjorie and I had tea. It turned into a longer visit than I expected. Eric didn't respond at first. His silence wasn't loud, but it was weighted. You didn't leave a note. Helen turned toward him, her expression calm. Didn't think it was necessary. He shifted slightly. You always make dinner. I just assumed. That's just it, Helen said, her voice even. We both assumed I always would. Eric's mouth opened slightly as if to reply, but he said nothing. His confusion lingered in the air, and she let it be. She didn't step in to ease it. She didn't rush to fill the space. I can make us some omelets, she offered after a moment, walking toward the kitchen. I've got eggs and spinach. Something quick. No, that's fine, he said, his voice quieter now. I'll grab something later. Helen paused in the kitchen doorway, watching him gather his keys again. Eric, she said before he left, this isn't about dinner. He turned back to her. Then what is it about? She considered her words carefully. It's about space. And who gets to have some? He said nothing, only nodded once, then left. The door closed with a soft click, not angry, not abrupt, just final in its own small way. Helen stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, then took a deep breath. She didn't feel guilt. She didn't feel regret. What she felt, surprisingly, was peace. Later that evening, she scrambled herself an omelette and ate it quietly by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on as dusk deepened. She drank a glass of cold water, wiped the counters clean, and placed her dishes gently in the sink. In the hallway, she passed the living room and noticed Eric's briefcase still resting on the bench. Out of habit, her eyes glanced toward it, but this time she walked past it without reaching down to move it. It could stay there. That wasn't hers to manage. Instead, she went to her room, pulled out the journal, and wrote without pause. I changed plans today. Not because I forgot something, but because I chose something else. It's a strange feeling, not explaining, not apologizing. I always thought that stepping away from a role meant abandoning it. But now I see, stepping away can also mean stepping into something real. She closed the journal, set it on her nightstand, and opened the drawer beside her bed. From inside, she pulled out an old envelope filled with brochures from years ago, places she and Robert once dreamed of visiting. Mountain towns, quiet lakeside retreats, a museum exhibit they had never gotten around to seeing. She sifted through them, not with longing, but with curiosity. Why not go somewhere now? Why not start marking days on the calendar for herself? She smiled softly and tucked one brochure, a quiet coastal town, onto her dresser. The next morning, Eric was already in the kitchen when she entered. He looked up from his coffee, uncertain. I overreacted, he said. About last night. I was tired. Caught off guard. Helen poured herself a cup of tea before replying. I understand. But I need you to understand something too. He looked at her. I'm not disappearing, she said. I'm not rejecting you. But I'm also not here just to fill your expectations. He said nothing, but she saw the effort in his eyes, trying to process a new version of her, trying to understand what this change meant for both of them. I've been doing things a certain way for a long time, she added. And I think I'm finally learning that I don't have to keep doing them that way. I'm still your mother. But I'm also Helen. And Helen has plans. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, he said. I hear you. She took her tea to the table and sat down. Then that's a start. There was no sudden resolution, no emotional embrace. Just a shift in posture, a softening. A step, tentative but real, toward a different way of being in the same house. Outside, the world continued in its usual rhythm. Leaves rustled across the sidewalk. A car honked faintly in the distance. But inside, in the quiet kitchen filled with the smell of tea and toast, something subtle but irreversible had changed. Plans had shifted. And Helen was no longer afraid to make them her own. The week unfolded with a quiet but undeniable shift. Helen no longer moved through the house as a shadow, fulfilling expectations unnoticed. Her presence now carried a rhythm of her own choosing, a steady pulse of reclaimed space, of small decisions made without permission or explanation. And though the changes weren't dramatic in themselves, they added up in ways that neither she nor Eric could ignore. On Monday morning, instead of standing by the window with her tea, she left the house just after breakfast. A canvas tote bag over her shoulder, her steps purposeful, she made her way to the neighborhood library. It had been years since she last entered that building, and as she stepped through its glass doors, she was met with the familiar hush of worn carpet, the faint scent of old pages, and the comfort of organized silence. She approached the front desk where a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, offered a friendly smile. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "I'd like to renew my library card," Helen replied, and the words felt almost rebellious. The young woman nodded and asked for identification. Within minutes, Helen held a freshly printed card in her hand. She wandered through the aisles slowly, reacquainting herself with titles she'd once loved and authors she'd forgotten. She selected a novel, something literary and unfamiliar, and a book on container gardening. Before she left, a small flyer pinned to the corkboard near the door caught her eye. "Local book club, Thursdays at 4 p.m., new members welcome." Without overthinking it, she pulled out her phone and took a photo of the flyer. She didn't know if she'd go, but the act of considering it felt like a step. On Tuesday, she walked to the park. The path curved through stands of maple trees now turning amber and gold. She sat on a bench by the duck pond and pulled out her notebook. Unlike her private journal, this one was meant for ideas, observations, simple moments worth remembering. She wrote down the sound of a boy laughing as he chased a dog, the way sunlight broke in strips through the trees, the overheard conversation between two women comparing soup recipes. For the first time in years, she was collecting the world again, not in service of someone else, but for herself. Back home, Eric began to notice the changes. It wasn't only that Helen was absent from the house during the day. It was the way she returned, more alert, more focused, more full. She no longer asked him if he wanted dinner at 6. She made her own schedule and invited him if she felt like it. Sometimes they ate together, sometimes not. And when they did, she spoke more freely, mentioning things she had read or seen, not waiting for his approval or interest. At first, Eric struggled with the adjustment. For years, the unspoken arrangement had worked, he provided financially, she managed the home. But now, the symmetry had shifted. He found himself watching her more closely, trying to decode the changes, trying to understand what they meant for him, for the house, for them. On Wednesday evening, Julia came over for dinner. Helen prepared a mushroom risotto and a green salad, pairing it with a bottle of wine she'd picked up earlier that day. The three of them sat around the table, the conversation flowing with unusual ease. Helen told a story about a librarian who couldn't reach the top shelf and nearly fell trying to climb the counter. Julia laughed, genuinely delighted. Eric, quiet at first, finally asked, "So you've been going to the library again?" Helen nodded, lifting her glass. "Yes. And the park. And maybe a book club if I'm feeling brave." Julia's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful." "It is," Helen said. "I'd forgotten how much I missed being out in the world." Eric stared at her for a moment. "What changed?" Helen didn't hesitate. "I did." Later that night, after Julia had gone, Eric lingered in the kitchen while Helen loaded the dishwasher. "You seem different," he said finally. "I am," she replied without looking up. "But I'm still your mother. That hasn't changed." "I know," he said. "It's just. I didn't realize how much of your time was spent around me." Helen turned to face him, drying her hands on a towel. "Neither did I. But it was." He looked away, then back. "Did I make you feel trapped?" Helen considered her words. "You didn't make me. But I stopped asking myself what I needed a long time ago." That's on me. He nodded slowly. I guess I just got used to things being a certain way. So did I, she said. But used to isn't the same as right. The conversation ended there, but it left a lingering openness between them, a space where something new might grow. The next morning, Helen attended her first book club meeting. The room was small, a corner space in the library with mismatched chairs and a pot of lukewarm coffee. 4 other women were already seated when she arrived, all in various stages of retirement. They welcomed her without hesitation, asking about her favorite genres and what she liked to read. They discussed a novel none of them had particularly enjoyed, but the discussion itself was engaging, layered with laughter and thoughtful disagreement. When the meeting ended, one of the women, Janice, invited Helen to join them for lunch the following week. Helen accepted. And just like that, her calendar, once empty and monotonous, had begun to populate with possibilities. On Sunday, she went to the park again and saw a poster taped to the bench where she often sat. It read, "Walking Group, Tuesdays and Thursdays, meet here at 9 a.m. She smiled, tore off the small slip with the contact number, and tucked it into her notebook. At home that evening, Eric passed by her room and noticed the glow of a reading lamp. The door was slightly ajar. Helen sat in bed with a book propped on her knees, a pair of reading glasses low on her nose, and a notepad beside her, scribbled with notes. He knocked gently. "You up?" She looked up, surprised. "Yes, come in." He stepped into the room, unsure of what he wanted to say. "You've been busy this week." "I have," she said, smiling. "It feels good." He glanced at the notepad. "You writing something?" "Just some thoughts," she said. "Nothing serious." He hesitated, then asked, "Are you happy?" Helen looked at him for a long moment. "I'm learning to be." Eric nodded. "That's good." He left soon after, the hallway quiet again. But Helen returned to her notepad and wrote down a single sentence. "Small revolutions begin with the decision to return to yourself." She closed the lamp, folded the covers over her lap, and let sleep take her gently. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn through the open window. Inside, for the first time in years, Helen was not just living in the house. She was alive in it. The office was buzzing with a different kind of energy on Monday morning. Not chaotic, but more animated than usual. Eric arrived just before 9 o'clock, coffee in hand, and immediately sensed the shift. Small groups of colleagues stood in corners, by the copier, near the kitchenette, talking, laughing more freely, some exchanging curious glances. He slipped past them with a polite nod, unsure of what he'd missed until he opened his email. At the top of his inbox sat a message from Sarah Langdon. Subject, Special Team Session, Wednesday, 3 p.m. He opened it. The content was brief, but clear. This week's meeting will take a different shape. We'll be discussing the intersection of family life and emotional balance in the workplace. Participation is voluntary but encouraged. Bring your voice, your presence matters. Eric blinked at the screen. It was unexpected. That kind of topic didn't usually belong in boardrooms or team updates. Most managers kept things technical, impersonal, task-driven. But Sarah wasn't most managers. And somehow, the message didn't surprise him. It unsettled him, but not in a bad way. He thought about Helen's words the previous week, "I'm not disappearing. I'm just not here to meet expectations anymore." He thought about how the house had felt lately, less silent, more alive. He hadn't expected her new habits, her outings, her book club. And yet, they had started to shift something in him too, something unspoken, something just beginning to take shape. On Wednesday afternoon, the conference room was filled with the usual suspects. A dozen chairs formed a wide semicircle. No PowerPoint, no whiteboard, no agenda. Just people. Sarah stood near the windows, sipping from the same green ceramic mug she always carried. "Thanks for showing up," she said once everyone was settled. "I'm not here to lead this in the traditional sense. I'm just here to start it." There was a pause. People glanced at one another. Someone cleared their throat. Work-life balance is a phrase we hear a lot, Sarah continued. But most of the time, we don't talk about what that actually means. We hide parts of ourselves the moment we enter the building. I think that separation, while sometimes necessary, can also create a lot of quiet damage. To our identities. Our relationships. Even our work. She let the words hang for a moment. So I want to open the floor. You can talk, or not. You can share something personal, or just listen. No pressure. But if we want to work better together, we might need to know each other a little more honestly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Deborah raised a hand, hesitant but brave. I think I forgot how to balance anything after my second kid, she said. I was trying so hard to be good at everything, here, at home, that I ended up feeling like a failure in both. There were soft nods around the room. Someone murmured, "Yeah, same." A man near the back added, "My dad got sick last year. I didn't tell anyone. Just kept working like nothing changed. I think I was afraid people would think I couldn't handle things." One by one, the stories came out, not dramatic confessions, but quiet acknowledgments of the lives behind the titles. Eric listened, unsure whether he'd speak at all. But the more he heard, the more something inside him loosened. Finally, he raised a hand. "I've been living with my mother since my father passed," he said. "She moved in right after the funeral. At first, I thought I was helping her. Keeping the house together, making sure she was okay." He paused, uncertain. The room was still, listening. But over time, I realized I wasn't just helping, I was controlling. Without even noticing. I made assumptions about what she needed, how she felt. I filled the house with silence, thinking it was peace. And lately, she's changed. She started doing things again. For herself. And it's making me see how much I've missed just being present. At home. At work. In general. Someone across the room nodded. "That's hard to admit." Eric shrugged. "It's harder not to." Sarah gave a small smile, but said nothing. She didn't need to. The conversation kept flowing, spiraling into reflections about burnout, about missed opportunities, about the stories people carry without ever being asked. By the end of the session, the air in the room felt different, less guarded, more real. Eric left feeling raw but relieved. As if something had been moved, not just in the office, but in him. That evening, back home, he found Helen in the garden again. The sun was setting, casting gold across the hedges. She was clipping a few sprigs of rosemary, her posture relaxed. "Smells good out here," he said. She looked up. "It clears my head." He stood beside her, watching her gather the herbs. "We had a different kind of meeting at work today." "Oh," she said, not pushing, just open. "Talked about family. Emotions. How much of ourselves we hide to keep things normal." It got pretty honest. Helen smiled softly. "And how did it feel?" "Strange," he admitted. "And good. I think I said things I didn't know I needed to say." They walked back toward the house in silence, the evening air cool against their skin. Inside, Helen placed the rosemary on the counter, then turned to him. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. Eric looked at her, then nodded. "I'm trying." "That's enough," she said. "Trying is a beginning." As she turned back to the stove, Eric stood for a moment, watching her in the light of the kitchen, the same kitchen he had entered 1,000 times before, now different somehow. Not because the room had changed, but because the people inside it had. And maybe that was the point. Real change didn't begin with big declarations. Sometimes, it began in a circle of chairs at work. Sometimes, it began with listening. And sometimes, it began with just one person saying, "I'm trying." The rain had stopped just before noon. The light outside remained muted, filtered through a soft gray sky, and the garden, freshly soaked, glistened with droplets on every leaf and blade of grass. Helen stood by the kitchen window, watching as small birds flitted between the branches, shaking off water and hopping through puddles. She was still in her house clothes, comfortable slacks and a soft blouse, and she had nowhere to be that day. And yet, she felt an unfamiliar anticipation settling in her chest. At exactly 2 o'clock, Eric arrived home early. He didn't enter with his usual purposeful steps or the sound of keys landing in the tray. Instead, he moved with a quiet deliberateness, carrying something in one hand, a small bouquet of daisies, simple and fresh, and a white paper bag. Helen turned from the window when she heard the door click shut. "You're home early," she said, not with surprise, but with calm curiosity. Eric smiled, somewhat sheepishly. "I thought we could have tea." Helen looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Tea sounds nice." They moved to the kitchen together without much conversation. Eric placed the daisies on the table, then reached for a small glass vase from the cabinet. Helen filled it with water while he unwrapped the pastries from the bag, 2 slices of lemon cake from a bakery Helen hadn't visited in years. The air filled with the scent of citrus and warm sugar. They settled at the table by the window. Helen poured the tea, chamomile, still steeping, and placed the pot between them. Eric leaned back slightly in his chair, glancing outside before looking at her. "I was thinking about what you said," he began. "About space. And presents." Helen didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch gently, giving him room to finish his thought. "I don't know why I didn't see it before," he continued. "I think I just assumed everything would stay the way it was. That you'd always be there, holding everything together." She gave a soft, almost amused smile. "I was. For a long time. But I forgot to hold myself, too." Eric nodded slowly. "You've changed, Mom." "I've remembered," she corrected. "Parts of me I buried. For peace. For survival. For habit." He stirred his tea with the back of his spoon. "It's strange. I don't feel abandoned. I just feel behind." Helen studied him, really studied him, and noticed something new in his eyes. Not just the weight of responsibility or routine, but something softer. An unspoken regret, perhaps. Or a recognition of what had been overlooked. "We can walk forward together," she said gently. "But only if we both agree to stop walking in circles." Eric exhaled, a kind of release in his breath. "Deal." They sipped their tea in silence for a while, listening to the soft clink of rainwater dripping from the gutters. The daisies on the table brightened the room more than expected, their white petals standing out against the dark wood of the table. After the tea, Helen stood and reached for a small box from the sideboard. "I want to show you something." Eric followed her into the living room, where she opened the box and pulled out a collection of photos, some already familiar, others not. Among them were letters Robert had written, old postcards, travel maps marked with dreams that had never come to fruition. "Your father and I had a lot of plans," Helen said, flipping through a folded brochure of a coastal retreat. "Some we made. Others, we waited too long." Eric looked down at the items, touched by the intimacy of the moment. "Do you regret it?" "Not the time we had," she said. "But I do regret the waiting. I regret thinking there would always be more time." She closed the box and set it gently on the coffee table. "That's why I'm not waiting anymore. Not for anyone. Not even for myself." Eric met her eyes. "Would you go? To one of those places?" "I'm thinking about it," she said. "Even if it's just for a weekend." "You should," he said, sincerely. Helen nodded. "Maybe I will." The light outside shifted slightly, the sky softening from gray to silver. The afternoon had become more than a shared moment, it had become a bridge. Not just between mother and son, but between past and present, between silence and voice. That evening, they made a simple dinner together, vegetable soup and buttered toast. Nothing extravagant, but the kind of meal that tasted better because it was made in companionship rather than obligation. Afterward, they moved to the living room, where Helen read aloud from her current book while Eric sat nearby, listening. Occasionally, he asked a question or made a quiet observation. The television remained off. There was no background noise except the sound of pages turning, of chairs creaking, of lives beginning to overlap again, gently. Before bed, Eric lingered in the hallway outside Helen's room. "Thanks for today," he said. Helen, standing by her door, smiled. "Thank you for showing up." He nodded, turned, and walked to his room. Helen watched him go, then entered her own room and sat at her desk. She opened her journal and wrote. "Something broke today. But in the best way. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a conversation. A gesture. A pot of tea. We don't need grand apologies. We need presence. We need courage in the form of small, consistent care." She closed the journal and looked out the window. The house felt different now. Not perfect. But more honest. And sometimes, that was more than enough. It had been almost 2 months since Helen began reorienting her life, not through a dramatic reinvention, but through small, consistent choices that had gradually reshaped the atmosphere of the house and the fabric of her days. There was a rhythm now, a quiet cadence to her routine that felt like it belonged to her, and not merely to the needs of others. Mornings often began with a walk to the park, where she joined a few other women from her book club for a gentle lap around the pond before coffee at a small cart near the west entrance. They spoke of books and local news, sometimes politics, sometimes aging, sometimes nothing at all. What mattered wasn't the subject, it was the sense of belonging, of visibility, of conversation without duty. Back home, she no longer waited for the sound of Eric's keys at the door or measured her day around his return. She had created her own markers, an hour for journaling after lunch, a weekly visit to the library, an occasional phone call with Marjorie, who had quickly become more present in her life than she had been in years. Helen's time was hers again, and with it came a soft but powerful shift in how she moved through the world. Her posture was a little more upright, her voice a little clearer. She had stopped apologizing before offering her opinion and had even started saying no to small things, out of self-respect, not rebellion. Eric, for his part, had changed too, though more slowly. It wasn't just the tea or the flowers. It was in the way he paused before speaking now, in the way he asked questions without rushing past her answers, in how he had begun to notice things he once overlooked. He had started leaving his office door open more often. Sometimes, after dinner, he sat beside her while she read. Other times, they simply shared the space in silence, each doing their own thing, yet aware of one another in a way that had not existed for years. One Thursday evening, Helen returned from her book club meeting to find Julia already at the house. She was seated in the living room, chatting with Eric over glasses of wine. Helen smiled at the sight, it felt organic, unforced. "You're just in time," Julia said, standing to greet her. "Eric was telling me about his meeting with that new department head. Apparently, they're restructuring the whole mentorship program." Helen took off her coat and joined them, her eyes bright. "Is that good news?" Eric nodded. "Actually, it is. I've been asked to co-lead a new training workshop. Something more collaborative. Less hierarchy." "That sounds like a great fit for you," Helen said, meaning it. "I'm still not used to speaking in front of people," he admitted, then looked at her with a half-smile. "But I'm learning." They talked for another hour, the conversation meandering with ease. At one point, Julia turned to Helen and said, "You seem different lately. Lighter." "I can't explain it, but it's beautiful to see." Helen smiled softly. "I think I just stopped waiting for the right time to enjoy my life." Later, after Julia had left, Helen sat at the kitchen table, reviewing an envelope she'd received earlier that day. It was from the community center, containing information about a 6-week creative writing course for older adults. She had hesitated when she first saw the flyer last week. But today, without much thought, she had filled out the application and mailed it. When Eric entered the kitchen, he noticed the open envelope. Something new? Helen nodded. I'm taking a writing class. He raised an eyebrow. Writing? I used to write all the time, she said. Poems, essays. Even tried a short story once. I don't know if I'm any good at it, but that's not the point. Eric leaned against the counter, thoughtful. You know, I've never really asked, what did you want to be? Before Dad, before me? Helen tilted her head slightly. I never had a grand career dream. But I always wanted to create something lasting. A story, maybe. Or just moments that mattered. He nodded slowly. You're doing that now. She met his eyes. So are you. The following weekend, Eric invited Helen to join him and Julia for lunch at a small restaurant downtown. It was a casual place with big windows and a quiet charm. As they sat waiting for their meals, Helen looked around and smiled at the families and couples filling the room. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged in those scenes, not as a background figure, but as someone who had chosen to be there. Julia reached across the table and touched Helen's hand. We were thinking of hosting a dinner next month. Just a few friends. We'd love for you to come. Helen smiled. I'd be delighted. After the meal, they walked a few blocks together, window shopping and sharing small memories. Helen told a story about a coat she once owned and lost on a train in Paris. Eric laughed, saying he had never heard that one before. You never asked about my 20s, she replied with a wink. When they returned home, Helen retreated to her room and pulled out her writing notebook. She wrote for an hour straight, the words flowing without struggle. She didn't know if they were good. She didn't care. What mattered was that they were hers. Before going to bed, she checked her calendar. The writing class began on Monday. A week later, the walking group had scheduled a weekend retreat. In between, her book club was selecting a new title, and Marjorie had suggested a trip to the botanical gardens. Her days were full in a new way. Not rushed, not chaotic, just whole. That night, as she lay in bed, the house around her settled into silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not empty. Not tense. Just stillness with room to breathe. And within that stillness, Helen smiled. The rhythm of her life had changed. And this time, she was the one keeping the tempo. The house smelled of roasted vegetables, lemon zest, and fresh herbs. Helen moved around the kitchen with unhurried confidence, wearing an apron patterned with wildflowers. The table had already been set hours earlier, not because she felt pressured to impress anyone, but because she had wanted to take her time, to make something beautiful and welcoming. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, casting soft patterns across the floor. The weather outside had given way to a cool, crisp day, one of those rare moments between seasons when the air feels lighter and everything seems clearer. It was Sunday, family lunch day. But unlike the many Sundays before it, this one carried a different energy. It wasn't just a meal. It wasn't just another ritual. Something had shifted. And everyone in the house could feel it, though no one said so aloud. At exactly noon, Eric came down the stairs, wearing a clean button-up shirt and a relaxed expression. He walked into the kitchen and paused at the doorway, watching Helen sprinkle chopped parsley over a platter of roasted carrots and sweet potatoes. "Need help with anything?" he asked. She looked over her shoulder and smiled. "You can bring the water pitcher to the table." He nodded and moved to do so, no protest, no tension. Just simple, respectful cooperation. Moments later, the doorbell rang. Julia stepped inside, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Something sweet from the bakery," she announced cheerfully. "I thought it might pair well with whatever masterpiece you've cooked today." Helen laughed. "You're too kind. But I'll never say no to dessert." They moved into the dining room together. The table was modest but warm, simple ceramic dishes, linen napkins, a vase of garden flowers in the center. The meal itself was colorful, filled with roasted vegetables, herbed rice, and a bright cucumber salad. The lemon tarts Julia brought would follow later, with coffee and conversation. As they sat down and began to serve themselves, Helen glanced around the table. It struck her how ordinary and extraordinary this moment felt at the same time. Just 3 people sharing food. And yet, everything had changed. The conversation began lightly, Julia commenting on a new exhibit at the local art gallery, Eric mentioning a podcast he'd started listening to. Helen listened and responded with interest, no longer passive, no longer shrinking herself for the sake of harmony. It was Julia who noticed first. "You're laughing more," she said, her voice warm. "It's beautiful." Helen raised an eyebrow playfully. "Are you saying I wasn't fun before?" Julia grinned. "You were always kind. But now you're, I don't know, more present. More you." Helen accepted the compliment without brushing it aside, which was something she had learned to stop doing. "Thank you," she said simply. "It feels good to show up fully again." Eric glanced at his mother, a curious softness in his eyes. "I've been thinking about that a lot too." Helen gave him space to continue. "All those years," he said, "I thought I was carrying so much. Work. Responsibility. Expectations. But I think I was just hiding behind them." Julia looked at him, gently surprised. "Hiding from what?" He paused. "From asking myself who I wanted to be. Not just at work, but at home. In life." Helen reached for her glass of water. "It's easy to lose ourselves in the roles we play. Especially when they become routine." He nodded. "You showed me that. Without pushing. Without blaming. Just by changing yourself." The table fell quiet for a moment, not awkwardly, but with reflection. Then Helen added, "It's never too late to change the rhythm." After lunch, they moved to the living room with mugs of coffee and the lemon tarts resting on porcelain plates. The window was slightly open, letting in the sound of wind moving through the trees. Helen curled into her armchair, Eric and Julia side by side on the sofa. "I have something to share," Helen said after a while. Eric and Julia looked toward her with mild curiosity. "I applied for something last week. A writing residency. Just a local one. 3 weeks, by the coast. They provide lodging and a space to work." Eric's eyebrows lifted. "That's amazing." Julia clapped her hands softly. "Helen, that's incredible." "I haven't been accepted yet," she said, holding back a smile. "But that's not the point. The point is, I wanted it. And I went after it." Eric leaned forward slightly. "What will you write?" "I'm not sure yet," she said. "Maybe essays. Maybe pieces about the women I've met. Maybe about myself." He smiled. "I think a lot of people would want to read that." Helen glanced toward the bookshelf in the corner of the room, once cluttered and dusty, now carefully curated with titles that meant something to her. Books of poetry, journals, photographs, and the returned novel from Marjorie that had unknowingly marked the beginning of her rediscovery. "You know," she said, her voice quieter, "for years, I thought my life was behind me. That everything meaningful had already happened. But I was wrong. It's not behind me. It's not ahead of me, either. It's happening now." Julia placed a hand gently on her arm. "That's exactly what makes you so powerful." They stayed in the living room longer than usual. No one was in a rush to leave. The television remained off. The conversation shifted from stories to hopes, from memories to dreams. And when the afternoon began to fade into early evening, Eric offered to clean the kitchen. Helen didn't resist. She let him. After Julia had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, Eric lingered by the doorway to Helen's room. "Do you think," he asked carefully, "we could start having lunch like that more often?" Helen nodded. "We don't need a special occasion for it." He smiled. "I'd like that." She returned the smile. "Me too." When the door to his room closed for the night, Helen turned to her writing desk. She sat down, opened a fresh page in her notebook, and began to write, not from memory, but from the moment. Today, we laughed. We shared food and words and space. Not because we were trying to fix something, but because we were ready to grow something new. Love doesn't always come as fireworks. Sometimes, it returns quietly, over lunch. She placed the pen down and closed the notebook. Outside, the sky was streaked with the fading colors of a day well lived. And inside, Helen was no longer waiting for life to happen. She was living it, fully, honestly, and entirely on her own terms.